Does Jesus use trick questions? That's what we're going to find out today in Luke 20. Well, we're coming now towards the end of Luke, and this is going to be our third gospel, our third book in the New Testament, and then we'll move on to John next. Jesus was in the temple and preaching the gospel, and the scribes, the elders, come up to him and says, who's giving you authority to say these things? The bottom line is, who's telling you this is okay? Who's giving you these messages? Are you secretly the disciple of somebody else? Are you just making this up on your own? Something like that. And Jesus does not fall for traps. He doesn't allow himself to be set up. That's, for sure. So he's not going to sit there and fall for this. But they're finally getting to this, like, okay, who's telling you can say all these things? We don't dispute you. I mean, that's the interesting thing. They oftentimes, or never, dispute him on the facts of what he's saying. That this passage points to Messiah, or this says this, or this says that. Instead, they just try to get into these outliers. And so then he says back to him, he says, okay, well, who was the baptism of John? Was that from man or from heaven? And they don't want to answer that question. They don't want to be tricked either. But the other part of it is that, they walk away, right? And you could say, oh, blah, 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 I'm not going to answer your questions. We're the ones who ask the questions around here, mister. But instead, it's different than that. They're playing politics. I mean, never would there be a time where you would be alone in this area. So there was probably a crowd. Crowd followed Jesus everywhere he goes. But the people loved John, and they believed in his baptism was from God. And some believed in Jesus too, and didn't this tone, I guess I would say that. So if they say, well, if this is from man, they're going to take everybody off who believes that the baptism of John is a forgiveness from God. And if they say, well, it's from God, then it almost diminishes their authority because they helped put John to death. They probably dismissed him, some of them, while John was living, went out and viewed him and pestered him to the point where he called them vipers and told them, to repent. So they really had no easy way out. They're not trying to think of an answer. They're trying to figure out what's the most political thing that they can do. And in this particular case, it was to walk away. And then Jesus gives this parable. We've talked about this one before, but a man plants a vineyard and then he left and went to a trip for a long time. He sent his servant to look after the vineyard and the tenants. So if I owned a lot of lands, I'd probably rent out parcels of it because it'd be a lot for me to farm myself. And so you would have tenants who would pay you a portion of the things you raised on this land to be a part of the land. It was tenant farming. That was a big thing. And so the tenants beat him up. And so he sends another, servant, and the tenants beat him up also. So this keeps going. And so eventually he sends his son. They haul the son out of the vineyard and they kill him. This is where we're talking about Jerusalem. We're talking about the temple leadership. This is what's going to happen to Jesus. That all these prophets came one after another, with the final one being John, and you killed them all. And now I'm going to send my son, and you know what? You're going to kill him too. These are messages that harken back to all the different prophets that were killed. And I think they would have understood what he was saying. You killed all of them. Now you're going to kill me. And they would have understood this for sure. And I don't think I emphasized this enough. I was thinking about this last night when I should have been sleeping, is that sometimes we talk about the parables and they're meant to be what we should be doing. And sometimes we talk about the parables and it's God in the parables, right? It's him rescuing the lost sheep. It's him who is the father who is grateful that the lost son comes home. And the son that is like, hey, I did everything you told me to do, loves him too. God points to himself in a lot of these parables, and maybe I just don't call that out enough, but that's where it's interesting to look at it. So should we be grateful when the lost son comes home? Yes, it's a parable for us too. We should be like that father, welcoming the lost son home. But we also have to realize at the same time, that is the point of view of God. He loves his old son. He loves the son that came home. He loves the sheep that went into the barn, and he loves the sheep that was lost. Hopefully that makes that sense. And then he goes on to give the psalm, which I think is Psalm 110, that the stone that the builders rejected became the cornerstone, meaning that you're building this great thing, which would be the temple structure, right? You're building the people part of the temple, and you rejected Jesus as you're not even a good enough stone to put into my temple. And instead, you're missing out because this stone is the cornerstone and will become the cornerstone of everything. And not only was this a passage that they would have known well, this was a big part of liturgies as well. And he is going to be rejected. He is being rejected right now. It says that if anyone crushes him, falls on that stone, he'll be broken to pieces eventually. You can take out that stone, you can ignore that stone, and you can even destroy that stone because you didn't want it in your structure. But what's going to happen to you is you're going to be the ones broken into pieces. Oh boy, you're not winning in the end. I mean, that's the whole idea. And it says that then they decide that they're going to lay hands on him. They're going to capture him, maybe beat him, something bad they're going to do to him, and they're going to do it, in the dark of night. So basically, the people don't see them doing it, and so that's what they're hoping to do. They're plotting it because they didn't finally figure it out. They knew he was speaking against them. He was talking about them, and he understood this. Like I said, it's kind of interesting because we go through these parables, and sometimes we get them, and sometimes we don't, or even we think, oh, maybe the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin and all that, they didn't get what he was saying. It just whooshed right over their head. No, they got it. These are learned scribes of the Old Testament. And when Jesus quotes the Old Testament, and it's important, the Old Testament gets quoted a lot in the New Testament. And that this is an important point just about the historicity of the Old Testament. Jesus quotes it. These are books people knew, learned from, read in the scriptures. They were around. Even though we don't have a lot of copies of the Old Testament in that same way, they're around to the point where they can get quoted exactly by Jesus. So that's kind of an interesting point, just kind of on the efficacy of Old Testament literature and the fact that it wasn't always oral tradition. It was written down and it was distributed in the temples. So anyway, they decide they're going to capture him in the middle of the night. We got this plot going on. And so they say spies who are going to pretend to be sincere followers of Jesus. Oh, we love you, Jesus. We just got a few questions for you, but they're really sent by the Sanhedrin. And so they ask the question that is trying to trap Jesus almost in the same way that he tried to trap them with the question of John. The people versus Rome. And maybe I can ask you a question you can't answer and keep the popularity of the people or keep Rome off your back. So it's kind of a trick. They're in the end trying to get him to say something. So it says that they can deliver him into the hands of the governor, Pontius Pilate. The idea is they don't have the power to kill people. Now they stoned people, and the Romans kind of, well, as long as you don't kill them, only Romans can put people to death. But, deliver temple justice, for sure, that kind of thing. And they don't want that. They want the governor to deal with them, which means they want a bigger punishment. So they send these spies in, and the spies are all like, Jesus, we know you're a man of truth. We know you say the right things. So tell us, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar, Rome? And this is, like I said, going to be a trick in the same line. If you say yes, then the people are mad. They don't want to pay taxes. In fact, there were whole groups of people like the Essenes who lived out in the countryside to avoid paying taxes. I mean, who wanted to hear the answer? Yeah, you should pay your taxes. But if he says no, then now it's Rome's problem because you're leading an uprising against the established law that's going on in this occupied Roman territory. So it's a trap. They thought, I'm sure they went back to their little rooms and they said, boy, that was awful how he trapped us. How can we trap him? Maybe that kind of thing. And would a man of God say that we should pay taxes to this evil entity? Even if you believed theoretically in paying taxes, The Romans are horrible. They're punishing us. We're starving. We're not living a great life. They're sending all this loot back to Caesar himself, who would pay taxes to this evil entity. And instead, what he says is, hey, hand me a denarius. So they give him a coin. And whose picture is on the coin? Tiberius. Tiberius Caesar is the Caesar at this time. And then at this point, he says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render the things of God that are God's. Render means to return. If I were to rent a car and I gave it back to the car rental, I rendered it back to them. Or if you stole someone's property and the police came to your door and they say, hey, give that back, I'm going to render it back, to the rightful owner. So give Caesar, it's his coin, give it back to him. Those are the things of earth. Those are the things of Caesar's domain. But give to God what is God's. And what's God's? The people. The people belong to God. He's saying, I think that you're capturing these people. You're keeping them away from God. You're keeping them away from the kingdom. All along, all this point, you are keeping people away from God. Fine, pay your taxes, but I want the people. The people are God's. That's the whole point. We're looking at the kingdom of heaven. We're looking upwards. We're not looking at this earth business. And I'm sure a lot of people were confused about it. You see all along this whole ministry, and Luke has talked about this countless times, where people would not be willing to give up the rich young ruler, his riches. Even Peter's like, we left everything for you, our wives, our family, things of earth. Think heavenly. In that particular case, he's not telling us to disregard the rules, the laws of this land. Instead, he's telling us that we live in the world. We live in the world of the Romans and the temple structure. But instead, we're going to do earthly things while we're here, but our focus is going to be on heavenly things, is the end of it. It's a very... I don't want to say complicated. It's not complicated at all, but you will see people from time to time saying, well, I can't pay my taxes because it goes to evil things. And that is not how it goes. So we have seen two different stories, the one with Peter getting the fish and the fish having the Roman coin in its mouth, that kind of thing. Paying our taxes and living up to our governmental obligations, things that we should be doing. We'll find out more about this as we go along. And then at the end of this story, then the people that were following him around realized we're not going to trap him right now. We wanted to trap him tonight, and we had this whole little plot, spoiled, or was foiled again. Anyway, or I'd have gotten away with it except for you lousy kids, that kind of thing. So that they realized they weren't going to get away with what they were trying to do. And then some of the Sadducees came back, and it's important that we say the word Sadducees here, came back to them, and we've heard this story before, with this preposterous story saying, okay, so imagine that this guy was married to this woman and he died before they had children. So in our rules and traditions, the brother would marry the wife to keep the family line going. But then he dies before she has children. And so we go through 7 brothers. And so now she's been married to these 7 brothers in her life, and they all go to heaven. They're in the resurrection. Whose wife is she going to be when she gets to heaven? Now, what's ridiculous about it is, first of all, this is a ridiculous story. Secondly, the Sadducees, and this is why it's important, didn't believe in the resurrection. They believed everything on earth was here and now. That is it. Remember, they only had the Torah. Even though the Torah does discuss these kinds of things, they only believed in the Torah. Most of the prophets talk about some of the resurrection ideas, even though, like I said, I think the idea was certainly there in the Torah. But they don't even believe any of this, right? They're just being preposterous and ridiculous. This whole thing is ridiculous. And it's kind of like, it struck me when I read this. When you're an atheist, you always have some kind of a question that is jarring. That if a Christian is talking about their faith, I would say that kind of shuts people up, right? That would be something like, oh, well, where did Noah put the dinosaurs? Or something that that the average person couldn't answer off the top of their head, just to embarrass them, to get them to shut up. And in this case, they're saying these 7 people who are going to be married in heaven. And anyway, so it says, you're not going to be married in heaven. You are going to be in the resurrected body. You are going to be equals with angels. It's not how the sons of God work in the resurrection. It's not that we're not going to know each other. And I believe we're going to know each other and we're going to know all the people around us. And he said that the dead are going to be raised. Moses said, and now we're going to invoke the Torah, which is what the Sadducees believe. So he knows he's talking to Sadducees, that the dead are going to be raised. Moses said, the Lord of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. The God is not the God of the dead. You can't have the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, unless these people were living. If they were dead, they don't have anything anymore. And so he's telling those people they're still alive. And the Sadducees did not expect to hear this because, well, they're pretty smart, smarter than everyone else because we run the temple and don't believe in the structure. And he is saying, even your Torah says this. And so it says they no longer dared to ask him any more questions. Whew. So Jesus is not going to fall for their silly stories or their trap that they have. So then he says something, and honestly, this blew my mind when I first read it. I don't think the times that I've read it in the past, I understood it. And it says that, how can you say that the Christ is the son of David, right? The Messiah is supposed to come from the line of David, when David himself said in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, which is technically Yahweh is kind of the name, I am what I am, or I am the God who rumbles the mountains kind of thing. But Adonai was used as a term to say my Lord. It was a deferential term to mean God or the Messiah. So Yahweh said to my Messiah, but how can that be, right? This is where he's getting at. How can this be if that person is the descendant of David himself? And I never, like I said, really understood this. So how can you say that? How can David talk to his own descendants? And when you're God, you have time and space and everything right there before you. That is really amazing. It's a really mind-blowing thing because David understood the difference between Yahweh and the difference between the Messiah. And everyone knew the Messiah who was promised to be in his house, to be one of his descendants. And when you're God, you have that possibility to make things like that happen. And I was like, wow, that is so cool. And then after hearing this mind-blowing story, he says to his disciples, beware of the scribes. They walk around in these long robes, fancy. They're fancy dressed. They love to be greeted in the marketplace. Hello, sir. How are you today? Given the best seat in the synagogue, places of honor at the feast. Yet they devour the widows' houses and pretend to make long prayers. But in the end, they're going to receive the greater condemnation. Now, the last part about devouring widows' houses has to do with the fact that when scribes could own property themselves, but essentially the widows would get into financial trouble. Remember, they couldn't really hold many jobs. If they held property, they probably couldn't hold much property. And most of the property went to their eldest son, typically, is how it went. So they were very poor and they didn't have much possibility of gaining money. And so if you came to your local rabbi or your local scribe and said, I don't know what to do, I can't afford the taxes on this house, or I can't afford to keep this land anymore. And chances are, remember, this was land given to their ancestors, right? If you were a tribe of Benjamin, you got Benjamite land. If you were the tribe of Manasseh, you got Manasseh land. And at some point you couldn't afford it. And so they probably owned this land for 1,000 years, right? And now they can't afford it. And so then the scribes would say, or the rabbis, this happened on a bigger scale too. Oh, well, I tell you what, I'll just pay for your land so that you can pay your taxes, and they'll give you enough money so that you could go get yourself an apartment somewhere here in the city or, outside the city. And I'm doing you a favor, right? So what they're doing is they're eating up those widows' houses and uh, as a favor to them, and essentially stealing their homeland, their home property. This is not a kindness. So that's what they were doing. And that ends chapter 20. Oh boy, this was a good chapter. What I'm going to meditate about is when I grew up Jewish, I didn't realize that there were the parts of God in the Holy Spirit, Jesus, and God the Father. I thought Judaism was a religion of God the Father only, and that somehow Christians kind of invented this other thing. And now when I look back at the Old Testament now, I see all sorts of places where we see God the Son, where we see the Holy Spirit, and lots of places where we see God the Father. And I'm going to do a little bit more reflection on the Trinity. And what I'm going to pray about is to make sure that my mind never asks God a trap. People get frustrated at times, and you hear it too. Like, people are like, God, why did you put me in this position? Or why did you take my parents? Or why did this have to happen? And it's because you're angry. And so you're asking a question that can't be answered like that at all. And, I want to make sure that my spirit is always willing to hear his message and never to put a question that is just a trap. And what I'm going to share with others is the fact that the Bible is so deep. These messages where Jesus includes himself in these parables are going beyond just teaching people a lesson of how they should act or what they should do, but instead teaching them about his nature. And it's throughout the whole New Testament, but it's also in the Old Testament. And we see all the places where Jesus quotes the Old Testament, where the apostles quote the Old Testament. This is one contiguous book from Genesis all the way to the end. One story with many different parts. And we see more and more how that's true. All right, everyone, thanks so much. I appreciate you listening and watching this. If you have any questions to ask me, you can always email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can put comments if you're watching this on YouTube. And I hope this has been good for you. I hope you're reading along with me. Thanks so much. Have a great day.